And we're putting to the panel this question: what are the labelling systems we presently have, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those systems from a producer perspective, an Australian consumer perspective, and an international importer, wholesaler, retailer, consumer perspective? So let's open up with, and we don't have to be sequentially up and down the table. You can bounce all over the place, or you can pass if you wish. A producer's perspective. Who'd like to start?
My name is Rachel Mackenzie. I'm from GrowCom. We represent the Queensland fruit and vegetable growers. I guess this is about the strengths and weaknesses. So talking about the strengths in terms of horticulture production won't take very long, because we have very few labels that have any kind of resonance and meaning for consumers. I think if I asked any of you to think of a label on horticulture produce that you could actually identify with, then you'd struggle. I mean, we do have things like Aussie apples. I think it's interesting that we've got this thing, it's called labelling systems, and I think a labelling system is a different thing to a label. And I think we've brought to the table, and what I think is fascinating about Red Tractor is that it picks up on what I think are three amazing things, which are food safety, country of origin labelling, and you know, progeny of product, and that sort of picks up on a patriotism thing and a thing that consumers can identify with. So we have a number of food safety systems within Australian horticulture. We have Fresh Care, which is an industry-owned system, which sounds very similar to Red Tractor, but is for the fruit and vegetable sector. It's now got an environmental component, but it doesn't really have a label that anyone really identifies with or can see. Then we've got Woolworths Quality Assurance, and we've got Coles. I think in horticulture we have this very strange situation that the people who are doing the right thing have so much compliance and so much it's not regulation, but so many requirements put on them. And as was described earlier, they are doing up to 3 different audits a year, costing them $40,000 a year. And then you've got 20% of the horticulture industry who do absolutely nothing. So I think that we have significant weaknesses in our labelling systems, in that we don't really have a label that reflects the good work of our good producers and provides them with a benefit in the marketplace that has resonance. We have a whole heap of legislation around country of origin labelling that's still being worked through, and I think there's some benefits and disadvantages there. But I think the ultimate story at the moment is one of confusion and not capitalising on the opportunities that we have. And the concept of Australian grown is actually being used as a proxy for clean and green. But has anyone really gone behind that to make sure? And I think that the horticulture industry, and I can't speak for anyone else, but we are so close to some kind of food safety disaster. The fact that the hepatitis occurred in frozen berries from China was just good luck, not good management. So we need to make sure that the clean and green concept that we so like to put upon ourselves is something that we can actually prove and demonstrate, and then we need to enable those growers who do the right thing to gain some benefit in the marketplace by some kind of effective label.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Who else wants to comment? And let's just keep the comments at this point from the producer perspective. We'll go to the consumer perspective in the second round.
I'll talk a little bit about pork and eggs. I can't talk on behalf of the industry, but they're the sort of producers and stuff that I deal with. From the pork industry, we've probably got 2 systems. One's APIC, which is the quality assurance system, and the second one's the pink logo. A few years ago when imported pork came in, most of the processed pork in Australia, up to 75% of the processed ham and bacon is imported product, but you can't import any product on the bone or that's not heat treated in its process. So all fresh pork, all products on the bone, and low heat treated salami products that don't have a high heat process are actually in Australian. So the pork industry created a logo to show that. It's been picked up particularly well by the fresh meat sector. You'll see it in in the supermarkets, and I think producers have actually quite liked that product, and they try and promote that as much as they can, because it's a sort of a non-compliance thing from their point of view. The other one is APIG, which is the standard quality assurance. You must have APIG to sell to Coles and Woolworths, and typically it's also a mandatory requirement for export of pigs. We do a little bit of export, not a lot of meat, but a lot of the offal goes overseas, so a lot of abattoirs will demand it so that they can offset their killing charges by selling offal overseas as well. So historically we haven't used that much of a brand. It's been an industry compliance stuff. That's probably changed in probably the last 12 or 8 months, where they've created separate categories for free range. So there's an APIC free range standard with a logo, and we did have bread free range until the ACCC had a chat to the industry, and now it's bread free range raised on straw, and that APIC actually has a logo, which is starting to be used, and producers can use that on their product. But that's a relatively new development, and there's been a bit of contentious around it, so how well it'll be taken up and stuff is still to be seen.
Thanks, Greg. Anybody else?
Only quickly, in the red meat industry, obviously everyone that is involved in production, obviously on farm, there's National Vendor Declaration, which is a statutory deck filling in around 16 questions from various things around production to withholding periods for chemicals and so forth, and then to, as I said before, a livestock production assurance system, which is audited by Ausmeat. And these programs, I think, the red meat industry, I haven't been in it for 40 years, but the red meat industry needs to be congratulated for identifying early these compliances that they've had in place, which has enabled them to build a reputation for a branding position.
Thank you.
Yeah, probably I'd just touch on a bit from a cattle feedlot perspective, and also just in general from a red meat and livestock perspective. I think one of the strengths in our particular sector is that I think on the world stage, Australia's renowned for having a competitive advantage with respect to its branding, because we're able to supply specific requirements with respect to their needs. And whereas if you look at our major competitor in export markets, that's the US, and effectively they've got a grading system which is prime, choice and select. So they've effectively got 3 grades. So that to me is certainly a key advantage for our current labelling system that we've got in place. And I think just from the perspective of the grain-fed label, and grain-fed was put in place when the National Feedlot Accreditation Scheme, which is the quality assurance program for the feedlot sector, was implemented 20 years ago, and it was effectively a proxy for eating quality at the time. The world's moved along a lot since then. Of course, we've had Meat Standards Australia. There's been massive developments in eating quality science. We're actually doing a review of the grain-fed minimum requirements at this particular point in time, and we're grappling with, what are the key attributes of grain-fed, given the fact that, a grain-fed product can be both a 400-day, Wagyu product, as well as a Bos Indicus 50, 60 days on feed product. And yet they're all grain-fed, completely different eating quality outcomes, and yet they're still nonetheless called grain-fed. So that's a challenge that we've got at the moment. We certainly haven't got there in terms of an outcome. So that's, I think, both a strength and a weakness. I think strengths from a grain-fed point of view, because grain-fed's underpinned by a pretty good quality assurance program. We've got independent annual auditing. It also covers, animal welfare, environment, food safety, biosecurity. So that's fantastic. You can't sell a product to the retail sector and to our export markets and call it grain-fed without being NFAS accredited, so that's an absolute positive. But nonetheless, we've still got challenges at this particular point in time on the downside with actually modernising those minimum requirements. And I don't think that's certainly that issue is confined to the grain-fed sector, because I think in general that there's some real confusion about, particularly raising claims. Was touched on today. About some of the issues with raising claims, what is sustainable, what is free range, and what is natural. We, for instance, grapple with that in the feedlot sector, because the grass-fed sector certainly want to label their product as natural, but that implies that everything else is unnatural. And the feedlot sector, for example, we feed natural products to cattle. They still are able to demonstrate natural behaviour. So why, therefore, should we not have natural or be eligible for natural? So this is some of the challenges we're grappling with around the Language and Standards Committee, which is a NOSMEAT committee. And certainly there's a lot more to be done in that space before we get there.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, did you want to make a comment about producers?
Consumer.
Okay, all right. Well, that's the second one we're going to take, so perhaps you could kick that one off.
I feel like with 20 years in fast-moving consumer goods and having spent a lot of time shopping, accompanied shops with mothers, fathers, helping people write their shopping lists, getting into home with them, what I can say overwhelmingly when we think about agricultural produce is consumers are confused. They are confused. There are so many types of labelling systems out there. We saw, I think it was Heather's presentation earlier today. They've got 3 seconds. And what they really struggle with when they're standing in front of a meat cabinet, for example, is when they've got, one product saying hormone-free. Well, what does that mean about the rest of these products? And it's just forcing them. It becomes too hard. And I think we need to be very careful. And I think certainly, I think the egg experience, there are some lessons there for us around, what we, particularly with marketing puffery and some of those claims or statements that we'd like to make. I think we need to be very, very cautious. We know that consumers don't have a lot of time. They do get overwhelmed. And I guess the elephant in the room is Australian-made, Australian-grown. The recent issue with nanas has consumers really starting to question, what do these green and gold logos mean? We've seen the response to that with the 25%, 50%, 75%. Go back to that consumer, that shopper, she's got 3 seconds. Is she really going to take the time to try and make sense of country of origin, where the product was packed, etc. So from a consumer's perspective, confused, I think, thinking about fresh produce, and again, some of the work I've done in that area, just the lack of consistency, and how can you have one group of green apples sitting to the left that says, from Australia, and then immediately next to it something from the right that's also green, product of America. Consumers are a little bit sceptical about how can all of this stuff actually be traced all the way through, through distribution facilities, to what I'm seeing displayed on a shop floor. So just a few insights gleaned over the last few years working with consumers and shoppers.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody else from a consumer perspective? We're talking about current labelling systems.
Yes, I think that consumers are let down, actually. The whole idea is that we should give them the opportunity to make the choice that they want to make about the product that they want to buy, but they can't get that information in any meaningful way with the labelling that we have at the moment. And I think for fresh produce, the irony is that we do have the systems in place, but we don't have the labels on the product to enable the consumer to even have any understanding of the system that we have underpinning that. So then the irony is that they go to places like farmers markets, which are the most notorious examples of where there are no systems in place. People are buying third-grade produce out of the Brisbane markets and saying that it's, Farmer Fred's, apple from down the road, when they don't even grow apples there. And so I think we have, collectively as agricultural industry, in the fresh produce sector, we are actually letting our consumers down by not enabling them to make the choices that they do actively want to make. And I also think we're obviously letting ourselves down, because that would be a bit of market share that we could be accessing.
Yeah, I'll follow on from the egg situation, because that's the bane of my life at the moment. No, you're right. And it's actually quite interesting, because the sort of the labelling view in the egg industry for a number of years is that there's an industry standard called Egg Corp Assured, which they tried to change and get trademarked. But in the labelling sphere, it was always said that the industry standard would be a basic sort of thing. So it's a compliance code. So you meet the welfare code, you meet all the food safety. So thing. So you could buy an Egg Corp assured product with some certainty sort of stuff. Wasn't a lot of credence claims in that, but the aim was to leave space for people who wanted to create a brand in the egg market sort of thing. So we've seen, you know, the RSPCA, Your Main Choice, Proof, and a whole heap of other people come in and try and create brands in that space. But then unfortunately in them trying to create their brands, that hasn't been done well. They don't have positive aspects about their brand. They only develop their brand by pulling down the rest of the industry sort of thing. So while it's a good strategy, it hasn't panned out very well, and hence the Treasury review and the ACCC review and all that sort of stuff, which is leaving a lot of confusion, because it started a lot of discussion around farm practices by consumers, whereas the ACCC action was all about how you portrayed the brand. So that's where a lot of the issues are actually around, but now we're talking about things that don't affect animal welfare in any way, shape or form and stuff. So it's created an issue for us in trying to let consumers have what they want by picking the brands and relationships that they've got, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the third part of the question. What are the strengths and weaknesses of current branding systems or labelling systems from an international perspective, either importer, wholesaler, retailer or consumer?
First one we've got in the pig industry's cost, in terms of we have a big coverage, like 90% of the industry's covered, but we can't engage the smaller producers because of the audit cost. You know, physically getting an auditor to drive and then audit a 20-sow farm is just not commercially viable at the moment. So how we engage that bottom end of the industry, and unfortunately when you develop a brand, they're the people who are not actually part of the brand as to what will bring you down, and that's the dilemma that we're actually up against, and we're starting to look as to whether there's technology solutions or something to that particular problem, because you know when and the work we look at in the States and that sort of stuff, when there's an undercover video over there, the first 5 or 10 frames of that will be a McDonald's logo or a Walmart logo. We've only just started to see that attack on brands in Australia. Probably the kids campaign against McDonald's was the first one we've actually seen. Our activists are a bit slow off the mark on attacking the brands, and there was one in Canada where the egg farm was linked to McDonald's, because that farm sold eggs to someone who supplied to McDonald's, but there wasn't anyone even in that farm eggs that went. There was no one even in that state of Canada that went to McDonald's sort of thing. So, but it still gets attached to your logo and brand and all that sort of stuff. So how we pick up these smaller people into the system that are quite often the risk that are going through the farmers' markets. And we have two views. The egg industry uses third-party professional auditors to do their auditors. The pig industry actually chose to have people who knew something about pigs and then train them up in auditing. So they actually have vets and consultants and stuff who do the auditing as well. So that's been a bit of a interesting contrast as well. But the cost of the audit process makes it very hard to get the coverage at that smaller end who may be at risk. And we see it in eggs. The small end of the market turns over quite regularly. So how do we keep engaging them in a brand and stuff's very difficult.
Yes, once again, I think I really enjoyed looking at the previous presentation around the Aussie brand, because one of the things we think is absolutely critical for horticulture production is that we have some kind of collective identity for Australian product overseas. We are the highest cost horticulture producers in the world, so therefore we need to really ensure that our product is being bought. We're never going to compete on price, so we're going to have something else that gives us an edge in those international marketplace, So branding is really important, but I think it's interesting. I mean, I sit up here and talk about horticulture, but horticulture is a bit of a nebulous concept, because a lot of people who grow fruit and vegetables, they don't think of themselves as someone who's part of the horticulture industry. They think of themselves as a strawberry grower or a carrot grower, and all of our levies are utilised in that way. All of our marketing levies are commodity specific. So we have some real issues in terms of improving our collective identity both within Australia and overseas. And I think we look at our overseas competitors like New Zealand, who go over there and really, you know, kick some goals with their single brand, that really strong, identifiable logo. And then we've got the, you know, Bandy Wallop carrot growers, you know, logo, and the, you know, the Stanthorpe strawberry growers, and trying to make some kind of impact on the international stage, and it doesn't really cut the mustard. So yes, I think we are watching the other industry sectors with interest, and hopefully horticulture can get its act together and be part of a single brand, because I think it's really important for the success of our industry.
Thank you, Rachel.
So on a global perspective, if you're Roma and a group of beef producers or lamb producers from Roma, you can take your brand, put True Aussie on it, and put it in a supermarket shelf in our global markets, and it's clearly identified as Australian product. The issues we're facing at the moment is the movement into China and the growth of China. A lot of the China and the way we are selling product in China with companies like Sanger is online. The problem there was that the online companies don't own any retail assets or physical assets. They're just an online company. They just move product through their online product. So the meat came into China in cold storage. Someone picked it up out of cold storage, substituted it prior to taking it to the consumer. Pork tastes was smoked to taste like beef. All these things are happening. So where we're up to is absolute labelling and fraud detection of traceability back here in Australia. So pre-packaged product going to cold storage and then delivered into China. And that's fundamentally we're up to in our global markets, which under True Aussie and the next evolution of True Aussie, we've got some federal funding to do these traceabilities in market. So the Q scanning will be there, right to give that end consumer the full traceability of where the product was actually made and when it was processed in Australia.
I suppose a lot of them has already been touched on. I suppose from an international perspective, and I think also this applies domestically, there's just great scope for brand owners to put whatever they want on their labels. Yes, there is certain requirements under the Food Standards Code domestically, and of course we've got the Competition and Consumer Act, which provided some enforcement capability with respect to misrepresentation and misleading deceptive conduct. But nonetheless, I think particularly with respect to raising claims, there's huge scope for brand owners, both domestically and internationally, to put, you know, whatever they want on those brand labels, and I think that's certainly a key weakness here. As I mentioned before, the advantages for producers of having a multitude of different brands for Australian produce to specifically meet the requirements of our customers internationally is also an advantage for our international retailers, customers, food service operators, etc. So that flows through the system. But of course, the downside of that is that we don't have that single united label unless we pursue True Aussie on their label. And so I think this is going to True Aussie is an absolutely something that is a good for Australian produce, because we do have some great attributes for our product. That clean green image is something that most international customers are very much aware of our Australian product. So that's something we need to take advantage of.
Thank you. Okay, now it's your turn. 3 quiet minutes in your head, scribbling down what thoughts or comments or things are bubbling around in your mind, and then 7 minutes to prepare a question or comment back to any or all of the panellists. Thank you.
Lisa, just regarding consumers and behaviour patterns and everything like that, it's all well and good for us to say how beneficial this logo would be for them, mainly domestically here I'm speaking, not exports. How can we effectively lobby our major retailers to all or both really get behind this and support it, to ensure that we are allowed to use that label on their pre-packaged stuff, on their fresh produce in store? How do we drive that publicly into getting them right behind us, so that then the consumer and then the producers will get all the benefit from?
I think anyone who's worked with the retailers in Australia would know that, you know, it needs to be a win-win-win. So if we have a retailer in Australia who is, who wants to demonstrate their support for Australian production, who wants to demonstrate fresh, for example, and that if Australian produce delivers equal to or above average category margins, then you're likely to get a retailer nodding, saying, yes, I see the merit in this type of program. But the way forward would be definitely to sit down with the major retailers, because I'm confident that there will be a win. Certainly the major retailers they have many products from around the world on their shelf. I think at times when they have removed Australian product, it hasn't always gone well for them. So I think there is a commitment to Australian, but it needs to be commercial benefit, for everyone as well.
Do you see the cut price retailers coming in from Europe into Australia now, and even Costco's from the States, that we could actually use that as an advantage to push this label forward? So with the Coles and Woolies is what I'm saying, for them to really get behind us and say, well, we've got Costco coming in, we've got these guys coming in, they're going to start affecting your brand. Would we be able to utilise that position to get our label up within Coles and Woolworths and then spread it to other retailers later on?
Look, it's a bit hypothetical, but if we were saying that our green tractor was about, these amazing, that the quality assurance and integrity systems we have, which for the consumer is that ultimate peace of mind. So if that's the benefit we're talking about. I don't know that there would be any major retailer in Australia, be that the incumbents or any new entrants, who wouldn't want to be part of that. I guess you could have a first mover advantage if you were to get closer to the the retailers who've been in Australia for the longest. But the benefit of that consumer peace of mind, I think every retailer would want that. I mean, behind the scenes, they all have amazing specifications. Anyone who's been part of the audit process would know that. It's something to think about. But it's given the global players who are coming into Australia, they would want to ensure that their shoppers have the same peace of mind as other retailers in Australia.
Would any other panel members like to comment on that question?
Terry, you're possibly aware that what was formerly Horticulture Australia Limited and now HIA is currently undertaking a project and has been for a number of years, which represents how difficult this is, which is trying to get a consistent food safety auditing system whereby you only have to have one audit, and that would then meet the requirements of Fresh Care and Coles and Woolworths. And I did actually ask for some more information about it as to where it was up to before I came, and I'm always told, it's highly sensitive because we don't want to upset the retailers. It's very sensitive negotiations. So hopefully they'll have something to tell us soon.
I'll just add something quickly to it. I begin to wonder whether that's ever going to happen. Seeing the pig and egg industry, because those two players need a point of difference. So they'll always be adding something to a QA system or something, so they've got a point of difference. We've also seen that their brands are becoming so much more valuable that their willingness to step away from that audit process is getting less and less. Their risk management is such that they still want to have some control, a double check, a shadow audit or something like that, because they're the one that's actually going to wear the food safety problems and all that sort of stuff. So their willingness to step away is getting less and less as litigation increases and the brand pressure comes onto their brand. Them stepping away completely, I can't see it happening into the future.
Okay, Dougal, did you have a comment?
Sorry, just quickly before I go to Dougal. So Costco, we're in Australia this week. We met with Costco this week. In just about every Costco store is a true Aussie labelling in big signage around their counters. They understand country of origin labelling. They understand the systems behind it. I think with the new entrants coming in, you've probably got more hope with them doing it in Australia than probably some of our existing.
Yeah, just probably it segues nicely, but
Thanks.
to what I was going to say. Thanks, Richard. And so, I mean, we regularly meet with Coles, Woolies, Aldi, Costco as well, and every meeting, one of the key agenda items which we discuss is about mandating the National Feedlot Accreditation Scheme for the cattle feedlot sector for all the beef that they source from the feedlot industry. They are reluctant to do that, and which I find incredibly frustrating because it makes so much sense for all the reasons that we've talked about, particularly from a reputational point of view, because if in fact we've got a feedlot has a heat stress incident, for example, and they aren't NFAS accredited and yet they're a supplier to Coles and Woolworths, they are at a credible risk because of that. So it makes sense for them to have NFAS accreditation among all their suppliers. Then they can also promote that fact. And I think to me, it's been frustrating though, all the time that we've tried to do that, they still nonetheless haven't done it. But by the same token, I think that point of differentiation is a key driving point, and I think the example of Meat Standards Australia is a good one there, because it wasn't until Coles had the No HGP campaign put in place that Woolworths started to look at MSA, and that was the reason and the main driver behind MSA in the last few years, and of course the grading numbers within MSA have followed. I think there will be potentially a chance that we'll have at least a retailer, if we develop such a label and a campaign, underpinning integrity system behind it, that will take it up. But I certainly agree that it'll be very, very, very difficult to get all retailers to be on board.
Okay, thank you. The questions and responses are excellent. We'll probably have to keep them a little shorter, otherwise we're going to run out of time.
Okay, so there's a couple of points to my question. Coming from the point of view of consumers, and kind of the stuff that I've been finding is that I'm primarily focusing on sheep and beef cattle production, so sorry to the eggs and the horticulture guys, but one of the comments of a consumer was, if you put a pile of corn and a pile of grass in front of a cow, it's always going to go for the grass. Now we know that that's not true. However, the idea of natural diet is grass over grain, and not necessarily because of what it's eating, but more the environment that they're in. The other point to my question is, do you think that the grass-fed marketing is such a new type of marketing for the beef industry, for example? Do you think the beef industry marketing against each other is just pretty much shooting the other guy in the foot?
This is probably a bit tangential for what we're discussing today, but let me comment. I think from the feedlot industry's perspective, we don't want to get in a situation where we're talking about grass versus grain-fed beef. I don't think that's in anyone's interest, because they're actually very complementary. It's a symbiotic relationship. Neither part of that beef supply chain can work without the other. So and I don't think it's in anybody's particular interest, that particularly at an industry level, that we support one without the other. And I think Richard probably would agree with that. There is absolutely science that would demonstrate that cattle would prefer, from a nutritional perspective, a grain-fed diet. We would only utilise that science if defending the industry. We would not, advocate that proactively. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Anybody else want to respond on the panel? No? Okay, next question.
Our table would like to know when we can expect the green tractor from the producers at the panel table. We were very impressed that the UK managed with their producers to get together to form the one label under Red Tractor, or the assurance scheme. And once we have green tractor, we would like to know when we can expect to get a food labelling system which identifies what's actually inside packages and whether it's Australian or not.
Okay, so national farmers are trying to coordinate this with government, I think, at a number of levels, without getting solely into the detail. This has been, the discussion around taking True Aussie to one label has been led by national farmers at a level, but I suppose I can only talk about that it is, in terms of what our whole of agriculture is talking about at the moment, it is a priority, and it's a priority being led, I think, by our Minister at the moment as well for agriculture. But when it comes to what's in the labelling, it's pretty easy for the red meat industry.
Yeah, I'll just raise a sort of counter challenge as to how much, if we have one common brand, are you going to like my battery cages in with your 500-day fed Wagyu under the same brand? Like, how do you protect your brand under all the pressure other parts of agriculture are? How do we start picking winners as to who's in and who's out and all that sort of stuff? So, which is slightly different from the UK experience, who got rid of some of those systems where they're likely to be maintained in Australia. So we've got a few little challenges which I think we can possibly overcome, but I think we might have to have a bit of a chat about some of those little details along the line.
Yes, and I think the challenge is to producers is for a very clear perspective on what you actually want to achieve. Because I think when you listen to this conversation, people have multiple objectives and everybody has their own perspective on what they think a single label will do and what it will deliver and what it will mean. And I think until we have a clear understanding collectively of what we want to achieve and a shared goal and vision about what we want to achieve, then, you know, creating a green tractor, attractive as concept as it is, will be meaningless. And I think one of the things, the conversation on our table was that, like cotton BMP, it emerged because there was a very clear driver. There was a clear driver in the UK around some of these issues with respect to UK product. We're almost in the opposite position in Australia in that we have a really, really good reputation amongst consumers, both domestically and internationally, about our product. So there's no sort of imperative for us to prove to our consumers that our product is good. I do think, though, we should be on the front foot. And I really think that a green tractor concept is good, but I think we need to be very clear about what we want and what we're trying to achieve, and make sure that we don't think that it's you know, one size fits all for everything, and make sure that we don't suddenly realise that we've jumped into bed with the battery hens that we don't want to be associated with.
Okay, last question.
I might be a little deaf, and I've been following the conversation, but no one seems to have mentioned the ultimate beneficiary, the consumer. Shouldn't we be asking them what they want?
I can tell you with absolute certainty when it comes to Australians buying beef and lamb, their priorities, their purchase drivers. So the consumers feel, they have lots of feelings about things, but when it comes to making decisions, their drivers are number 1, price, number 2, nutrition, number 3, convenience and versatility, number 4, taste, and overall, you know, doing the right thing falls much further up the list. So if we were sitting here together saying the primary reason we want to label and reassure consumers about you know, the integrity of their product, it is not it will not fundamentally drive demand. So so you know, here and now commercially, what it can do though is we need to ensure that we continue to have consumer and community support for agriculture. A label may be one means by which to do that, but will it fundamentally drive consumer behaviour? Certainly where we do understand purchase drivers for red meat, I don't think it's unlikely to see significant volume move across from poultry or pork or chickpeas into red meat. So. Unfortunately, yeah. Domestically, sir, that is correct, yeah. Yeah.
Not for red meat, no.
No.
Okay.
So, yeah, Australia would be a developed market for...
Yeah, in terms of the consumer, there isn't one. It's a myriad of them sort of thing, and they are very much driven for price. For all the media hype and all that sort of stuff, caged egg sales at worst are probably falling about 1.5% a year in Australia by volume, and we suspect that they might even be growing, that a lot of the free range eggs have to get put down into cage cartons to meet that market sort of thing. So when you actually look at, yeah, this is a segment of the market that may benefit from that, but for all the hype, you know, caged egg sales are still, you know, they're the perfect product. They're anti-marketed. they're in the wrong shelf position. They're usually in a black and white carton, and they still sell as many as them we can produce. Probably we're selling more than we can produce because they're going out through a lot of chains now, fruit stores and stuff that we don't check. So when we look at what actually the market wants and what the consumer wants, quite often a lot of people think what the consumer wants is what the loud consumer wants. So it's a very much a segmented market. But again, across that market, there is still some traits that you might better relay in a label around Australianism and stuff like that. But price, we find safety, because the Chinese berries knocked off 8 people or something. We do that in a couple of days from eggs. With salmonella and stuff as well, as would other products and stuff. Beef's probably in there in those places too when it's not handled well and all that sort of stuff as well. So there's some other issues around safety as well we have with the domestic products.
Okay, I think our time has beaten us. Would you please thank our panel?